Lyndon B Johnson was one of America's great presidents. His civil rights legislation in the 1960s dramatically changed the course of history. Following his reforms, thousands of Democrats left the party for good. The new laws enabled millions of coloured people to vote for the first time. Many of them developed a lifelong loyalty to the Democratic Party. So Johnson had a huge impact on politics. He divided opinion both inside the Democratic Party and throughout the country. He believed he had a great vision of what he called the Great Society. For him, that meant greater equality within society and greater opportunities for both people of colour and people of poverty in general. He believed the federal government should play a central role in creating that equality. Johnson had been elected to Congress as a young man in 1937 on a New Deal platform set out by Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was an extremely ambitious, hard-working politician, often working 18 or 20 hours a day. By 1954, he had become Majority Leader of the Senate and helped pass many of Eisenhower's important initiatives into law. He knew how Congress worked, became an expert at passing legislation, so that by 1960 he was one of the most senior Democrats in the party. He ran for the presidential nomination but was defeated by John F. Kennedy, who later selected him as his running mate. He became the 36th president on the 22nd of November 1963, just a couple of hours after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. In terms of domestic legislation, he was one of the country's most influential presidents. He pioneered three major pieces of civil rights legislation through Congress, as well as promoting social security, health care, and major reforms in education. However, he is best remembered today probably for his role in escalating the Vietnam War. Eisenhower had warned Kennedy about the Vietnam situation. The French army had lost over 50,000 men there after the Second World War. Johnson was also aware of this, but 1964 was an election year, so he didn't want to be seen to be soft on communism. Barry Goldwater, a right-winger, was the Republican nominee and a strong anti-communist, even to the point of threatening nuclear war against China. Johnson had outmanoeuvred him on this point with the Daisy ad, highlighting the dangers of a nuclear war. Johnson also gave assurances that he would not send American boys to Asia to fight a war that Asian boys should be fighting for themselves. He later broke this promise, however, the biggest mistake of his presidency. After the 1964 election, Johnson was faced with two basic options, either escalate or withdraw from Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of North Vietnam, had been sending weapons and other supplies to South Vietnam communists for years. The 20,000 or so US military advisors there were under intense pressure. Most military and congressional leaders believed that an overwhelming show of force on the part of the US would actually force Ho Chi Minh to negotiate and agree to a neutral South Vietnam. Johnson also used diplomatic channels, promising huge US investment in South Vietnam if agreement could be reached. However, Ho Chi Minh was not interested in negotiation. He was a tough warrior who had fought both the Japanese and French over the previous 20 years. He saw the United States as another external enemy that he would fight to the end. On the 2nd of August 1964, North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin area. This followed a number of skirmishes in previous days. The Maddox returned fire, damaging two of the three boats. Another supposed attack occurred 2 days later. However, bad weather combined with certain malfunctions of the US ship led to a belief that they were being attacked by additional North Vietnamese boats. This incident was reported to senior military officers, who in turn reported it to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. The message was deliberately exaggerated and distorted. It seems certain now the second attack never actually took place. However, the incident quickly led to the Tonkin resolution, which Congress passed a few days later. This resolution gave the President the authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. This resolution, passed by Congress on the 7th of August 1964, was almost a declaration of war, in fact. In fact, it led to the US becoming fully involved in the Vietnam War. By the end of 1964, US troop numbers in Vietnam was still just about 23,000 or just over it. However, by early 1965, the president had to decide either to escalate or withdraw. On the 13th of February 1965, he announced a new, intensive 2-month bombing campaign known as Rolling Thunder. He also increased troop numbers to 175,000 by the end of 1965. Actually, 3 years later, they had reached 535,000. Despite such a massive bombing campaign and increased troop numbers, the conflict was still raging on at the end of his presidency. By then, over 30,000 US soldiers had lost their lives in the conflict. It was a difficult conflict, in fact, completely different to the Second World War. American soldiers found themselves fighting an invisible army which avoided direct confrontation. The Vietnamese used hit-and-run guerrilla-type tactics. They laid endless death traps in forests and mountains. Many of the Vietnamese were part-time fighters, actually, who also worked as farmers and tradesmen, so it was impossible to know who the real enemy was. The Vietnamese also had a far superior knowledge of the terrain, the mountains, the lakes, rivers and forests in the area. The US air bombing campaign was largely counterproductive, consolidating the entire Vietnam population against the external enemy. Ho Chi Minh was prepared to fight on for years. As the war wore on, the US government began to draft middle-class Americans. This created huge anti-war demonstrations as students of draft age demanded an end to the war. Throughout 1967 and 68, a strong resistance movement to the war was developing. Thousands of students gathered outside the Pentagon and the White House, chanting slogans such as, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today?" The Tet Offensive, which began in January 1968, seen several South Vietnam cities attacked by North Vietnam communists. The US Embassy in Saigon also came under attack. Daily news reports showed the US had lost control of the war. Ho Chi Minh was supported by both China and the Soviet Union. The United States could not use nuclear weapons without risking a Soviet response. They could not invade North Vietnam without provoking China, as happened in Korea. So the middle course adopted by Johnson failed to produce positive results. His escalation of the war in early 65 was seen as a disaster 3 or 4 years later. By 1968, things were actually getting worse. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were shot dead early that year. Many Americans began to wonder what their army was doing 10,000 miles away. But by then, the president could not withdraw without admitting total failure. His opinion poll ratings were dropping, so he withdrew from the 68 Democratic Convention. By late 68, Johnson actually ordered a ceasefire in the bombing campaign as peace talks were already underway in Paris. However, these talks also failed. Richard Nixon won the 1968 election, promising he had a secret plan to win the war. Elsewhere in foreign affairs, the United States took a strong pro-Israel stand in its conflict with the Arab nations. The Six-Day War in June 1967 saw Israel expand its territory. Afterwards, the United States supported Israel's claim to the occupied territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And Johnson met with the Soviet leadership afterwards to reach an understanding in relation to these issues. In relation to Central America, the president also became involved with the Dominican Republic. Here, a popular elected socialist leader, Juan Bosch, was replaced by right-wing dictator Riyad Cabral, with the help of American military support. In Panama, the United States also got involved. There were riots in relation to ownership of the canal. US military forces put down a rebellion there. However, Johnson later entered negotiations which eventually led to a treaty in regard to the canal when Jimmy Carter was president. Despite ongoing tensions, Johnson did manage to create an agreement with the Soviet Union in relation to nuclear weapons. They agreed to ban the testing of nuclear weapons in space, on the moon's surface and other planets. They also agreed a nuclear non-proliferation agreement, which in effect meant that both superpowers wouldn't sell nuclear weapons to other nations. The president was much more successful in domestic policy. He promoted 3 major civil rights bills through Congress in 1964, 65 and 1968. The first one in 64 outlawed discrimination in regard to race, colour, religion, sex and national origin. In practice, it prohibited separation of white people from coloured people in hotels, in bars, in schools, restaurants, just about anywhere people were offered services. It's regarded as one of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history. The following year, 1965, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders organised a march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital of Alabama. They were attacked by racists and by police dogs. Johnson responded to this situation by pushing through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It got rid of literacy tests as a requirement to vote. It also provided federal registers and marshals to enroll African American voters. 3 years later, in 1968, another civil rights bill was introduced which banned discrimination in housing in regard to the sale, the renting, and in regard to loans to buy a house. The three acts changed the nature of American politics. It tripled the number of coloured people who went to the polls. Meanwhile, millions of African Americans began to vote Democrat, a tradition that has lasted to this day. Lyndon B Johnson also pushed through the Higher Education Act of 1965, which enabled poor families to attend college for the first time through federal grants, loans, and scholarships. He also set up a task force to look at ways to eliminate poverty. They in turn set up the community action agencies, which would coordinate federal and state assistance to people in need. In education, it was called the Head Start program. Also, free legal services were targeted at poor families. Those below the poverty line reduced from 20% to 12% between 1964 and 1974. In 1965, the Social Security Amendment Act set up both Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare was designed to help the elderly. Medicaid was designed to help people of all ages who were sick or disabled. In 1965, Congress also passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which greatly reduced discrimination in regards to immigrants. The new law stopped discrimination against Eastern Europeans and Asians. Despite such improvements, however, there were race riots in 1967 and 68. Johnson responded to this by setting up the Kerman Commission to study the causes of these riots. They found the main cause of the riots was discrimination against people of colour. The president found this analysis difficult to accept in view of all that had been done. However, in regard to his personal life, Lyndon B Johnson married Claudia Taylor in 1934. They had 2 daughters. He worked for 4 years as a teacher in his home state of Texas. By his mid-20s, he had become a congressional aide. He won a seat in Congress at the age of 28. In regard to domestic legislation, Johnson was one of America's greatest presidents. However, his reputation was somewhat undermined by his escalation of the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon regarded him as one of the best presidents of the 20th century. Lyndon B Johnson was born in Stonewall, Texas in 1908. He died there in 1973 at the age of 64.